The end of the world didn't always come with leather jackets and flamethrowers. In the late 50s and throughout the 60s, filmmakers started imagining what might come after humanity. Stories shaped by Cold War tension and atomic dread. Movies like Planet of the Apes and The World, the Flesh and the Devil leaned philosophical, meditating on isolation, race, and survival. But in the 1970s, things got stranger. Films like The Omega Man and A Boy and His Dog introduced a rougher, more chaotic version of the apocalypse, featuring loners, mutants, desert landscapes, and darkly humorous undercurrents. Still, it wasn't until George Miller's Mad Max, and even more so The Road Warrior, that the genre's visual identity clicked into place. Dust storms, wrecked highways, salvaged armor, and gasoline-fueled desperation paved the way for many imitators. From there, the genre exploded. Into VHS bins, B-movie theaters, and comic books, you'd find crumbling cities, cannibal punks, doomsday cults, and wasteland rebels dressed in whatever hadn't already burned. While the stories were often simple, survival, revenge, redemption, the style was bombastic, wild, and unforgettable. These films typically shared a few key traits: ruined landscapes, collapsed social systems, improvised gear and weaponry, and a bleak yet stylized tone that often mixed absurdity with raw, brutal reality. By the mid-80s, the apocalypse had become its own playground. And into that playground strolled Radioactive Dreams, a film that mashed up hard-boiled detective tropes with a punk synth soundtrack, comic book chaos, and post-nuclear surrealism. Less a warning of what's to come, and more a celebration of the weird. Within the grand pantheon of post-apocalyptic adventures, Radioactive Dreams stands as one of the more elusive entries, primarily due to its poor distribution and questionable rights issues, despite managing to earn back double its original budget. The film marked Albert Pyun's second feature, following the runaway success of The Sword and the Sorcerer, the highest-grossing film of his career. Rather than launching him into studio-backed prestige projects, however, Pyun instead charted his own course, going on to write and direct a prolific array of sci-fi and B-movie oddities that would cement his legacy in cult cinema. One could joke that all Pyun needed to make a film was a desert and a half-decent camera. Viewers familiar with Red Letter Media, who have featured several of his films in their Best of the Worst series, will recognize the recurring gags about his fondness for dusty, rock-strewn backdrops. Pyun maintained this wasn't always intentional. He was a resourceful filmmaker with an uncanny ability to secure funding, and much of his success came from knowing exactly where to spend. His post-apocalyptic settings were as much about creative expression as they were about cost efficiency. To make Albert Pyun's career even more impressive, the story goes that he actually cut his teeth on Japanese cinema in the mid-70s, after being scouted by the legendary Toshiro Mifune and going on to assist Akira Kurosawa before returning to Hawaii to shoot a series of commercials which would arguably inform his future directorial sensibilities of producing breakneck adventures. And it was arguably the Cannon Group who gave Pyun his greatest run of opportunities. Although his work occasionally brushed up against major studios like MGM and Paramount, usually through distribution or licensing deals, he was never truly brought into the fold with full creative backing. It's tempting to imagine how his career might have evolved had a studio like Fox or Paramount entrusted him with a proper budget and the freedom that came with it. Despite The Sword and the Sorcerer's commercial triumph, Pyun never received a formal studio deal. Instead, he thrived in the cult and straight-to-VHS market, where lean budgets and fast turnarounds were not just expected, but embraced. For distributors, Pyun was a reliable asset: low cost, quick delivery, consistent returns. Why fix what wasn't broken? Radioactive Dreams was not the result of any commercial setback, but rather a deliberate pivot. Pyun shot the film on a budget even smaller than his debut, embracing inventive guerrilla-style filmmaking. It was an early showcase of the scrappy, high-concept, low-budget aesthetic that would define much of his career. So, what is it that makes Radioactive Dreams so special? It's not simply because it's an incredibly overlooked and underrated feature, or that it features a mysterious genre-blending soundtrack that brilliantly steers the narrative. It's not even that the film feels like Mad Max and Blade Runner had a child, only for it to be adopted by cult Japanese director Takashi Miike. The truth is, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what makes the film so special, but if Pyun had one defining trait, it was sheer enthusiasm, and Radioactive Dreams radiates with it. That unfiltered energy spills over into the performances, carried by a cast made up of fresh-faced newcomers and seasoned veterans. There's a scrappy confidence to the whole thing, a sense that, even when the seams show, the film is having a blast just being itself. And that's largely the key to Albert Pyun's charm as a storyteller. His scripts are often chaotic, overflowing with more ideas than they can neatly contain, but they pulse with energy and invention. His characters, flawed, quirky, and endearingly human, shine through as offbeat champions of good. Any rough edges in the storytelling are often smoothed over by sheer visual flair, kinetic set pieces, or a well-timed splash of pastiche. Pyun's worlds may be large, messy, and confusing, but his protagonists always feel grounded in relatable terms, fumbling their way forward with heart and hope. In the case of Radioactive Dreams, the story begins on April 1st, 1986, when a nuclear bomb is dropped and two young boys, Philip Chandler and Marlo Hammer, are taken into an underground fallout shelter by two shady characters. Left to their own devices after the adults disappear, the boys grow up in isolation, devouring pulp detective novels, swing music, and dreams of a more stylish, civilized world above. Cut to 15 years later, it's 2001, and the boys, now young men, played by John Stockwell and Michael Dudikoff, finally dig their way out into the surface world, only to discover a lawless, neon-tinged wasteland overrun by gangs, mutants, and madness. Dressed in sharp suits and armed with 1940s lingo, they hit the road in a battered Chevrolet Monte Carlo, determined to become private detectives. Their journey quickly spirals into a chaotic chase for a pair of keys that can activate the last known nuclear missile, an item that passes through the hands of femme fatales, chiefly Miles Archer, played by Lisa Blount, trigger-happy children, and red-wigged irradiated bikers. Along the way, they cross paths with Rusty Mars, played by Michelle Little, a street-smart survivor who adds both romance and trouble to their odyssey. But as the stakes rise and enemies close in, Philip and Marlo come to realize that in a world gone mad, the only people they can truly rely on are each other. What makes the film endure is its tonal cocktail, a mutant hybrid of noir, comedy, musical, and post-apocalyptic grit. It's less a film that's scored by music and more one that moves in rhythm with it, as if the movie was built around the songs rather than the other way around. Punk rock, synth pop, bebop, and swing collide in a soundscape that gives the film its relentless pace. Music doesn't just accompany scenes, it often is the scene. Midway through, our gumshoe heroes stumble into a glowing neon underworld, and up pops Sue Sad, practically out of nowhere, crooning guilty pleasures in full MTV music video mode. It's jarring, electric, and totally in line with the film's anarchic energy. Elsewhere, songs by Mary Ellen Quinn, Lisa Lee, Lynn Carey, and Jill Jacks help color the radioactive world with texture and tone. The soundtrack becomes both compass and fuel, carrying the film through each madcap twist without ever pausing to explain itself. Over time, the soundtrack has achieved cult status in its own right, with the Spanish LP release being the only edition to feature the complete track listing. As for the performances, Radioactive Dreams lives and dies on the chemistry between its leads. Michael Dudikoff, best known for action fare like American Ninja, plays Marlo Hammer with a kind of clueless charm, part tough guy, part wounded kid, and a far cry from the hardened roles he'd later become known for. John Stockwell brings a steadier, more grounded presence as Philip Chandler, who also narrates the film in a loving pastiche of classic gumshoe noir. Together, they make for a strange but oddly compelling double act, detectives out of time fumbling their way through a broken landscape that barely makes sense. Michelle Little shines as Rusty Mars, bringing street smarts and injecting charm into what could have easily been a throwaway sidekick role. She holds her own even as chaos swells around her and manages to surprise in more ways than one. Lisa Blount adds a sultry fire to her portrayal of the conniving Miles Archer, while tertiary support grounds the film's absurdity with just enough sincerity to make it work. Veterans like George Kennedy and Don Murray are rather underutilized, but that hardly matters when Dudikoff and Stockwell are doing the heavy lifting so capably and holding our attention every step of the way. And that's before even considering Albert Pyun's directorial chops. Visually, this might be one of his most inventive works, with help of course from cinematographer Charles Minsky, whose credits include Pretty Woman, Runaway Bride, and The Princess Diaries. What could have easily been confined to barren desert landscapes instead spans a vibrant mix of settings: a neon-drenched walled city, a sewer crawling with a giant radioactive rat, smoke-filled shootouts, and dingy corridors straight out of a pulp fever dream. The action set pieces are playful, the dialogue delightfully offbeat and rapid fire, even featuring a pair of gun-toting, foul-mouthed kids who feel like they stumbled in from a lost Tarantino short. Shot for a reported $3 million and featuring props and makeup expertise from 5-time Academy Award winner Greg Canham and Kevin Yeager, it's nothing short of a technical marvel, even though it may come across as a Poundland Blade Runner at times. Throughout, Pyun keeps the energy high and the madness just barely reined in. The result isn't always tidy, but it holds together with a kind of internal logic, chaotic yet assured, much like the world it portrays. In the end, Radioactive Dreams isn't academically perfect, but it's my kind of perfect. Messy, vibrant, and unapologetically itself, it's a cartoonish mixtape from a director who did things his own way. Whether or not it gets the full 2K or 4K restored treatment it deserves, it remains a glowing artifact of 80s cinema, blasting swing and synth in a world gone mad. If at this point everything still sounds utterly bonkers, well, join the club. Stranger still is that Radioactive Dreams exists in several versions, spanning US, European, and Asian territories. The original US theatrical cut runs a brisk 90 minutes, though some European editions list slightly longer runtimes. However, these use the PAL format, which naturally speeds up playback, making differences mostly cosmetic. Structurally, they remain close to the US cut, with only minor tweaks. A reshuffled intro, reworded text, and an awkwardly inserted shot of Miles picking up the missile keys, repurposed from the film's ending, is an apparent attempt to patch a perceived plot hole. This does come off as clumsy and likely wasn't supervised by Pyun himself. Aside from these superficial changes, the European cuts follow the same trajectory and still offer a fun, if sometimes puzzling, ride. The US version opens with a minimalist white-on-black text scroll, setting up the backstory to the missile keys, a classic MacGuffin really, along with a few fragmented flashbacks. Like its European counterparts, it's a cryptic introduction that offers little clarity by the film's end, but that's part of the appeal. It's about the ride, not the destination. The director's cut, however, or work print depending on who you ask, previously released only on Japanese laserdisc, is a different beast entirely, featuring both new material whilst also omitting scenes. Gone is the opening text scroll. Instead, the film begins with an extended sepia-toned prologue that delves deeper into Philip and Marlowe's backstory. It's a more emotionally resonant opening that reframes the film as a tragicomic character piece rather than just a post-apocalyptic romp. This version also alters the fate of a key character and expands scenes like Philip's torture at the hands of a deranged Sternwood, played by Norbert Weiser. At the same time, it drops some of the US cut's more eccentric flourishes, most notably the giant radioactive rat which pursues Marlowe as he attempts to escape through a sewer system. The added exposition, which bookends the feature, enriches the world and deepens the lead's emotional arcs, delivering greater catharsis by the final act, though it does come at the cost of pacing. Still, it's a more somber, textured film, likely closer to Albert Pyun's original intent, without losing its chaotic charm. While it did receive a VHS release in the 80s, The only other notable additions remain the Japanese laserdisc and a German DVD limited to 1,000 copies, which was packaged with the incomplete soundtrack CD. Although 35mm prints have on occasion resurfaced for special screenings across Europe and the US, even Albert Pyun himself, up until his final years, knew very little about the whereabouts of the original negative, and alongside Captain America, it remained one of his dying wishes to see restoration. Interestingly, 2025 saw the release of a Blu-ray featuring Pyun's own final vision of Captain America, a battered work print assembly released by Yippee Mother Video and scanned from a 2K element held within Pyun's estate. This version significantly alters the narrative we've known for years. By shifting the story into a non-linear structure, it gives the film a surprising emotional weight that was never as apparent in the original cut. It's easy to see why studios might have resisted this approach at the time. It wasn't the kind of editing style that suited a mainstream theatrical release. But with the benefit of hindsight, and with what we understand now about Pyun's intentions, this cut feels like a far more interesting and deserving take on the material. It doesn't just change the pacing, it changes the viewer's relationship to the characters and themes, and in doing so, reveals a version of Captain America that arguably never got the credit it should have. If you're wondering how a release such as this is even possible, it's well known that Pyun was known for shooting far more material than made it into his theatrical cuts, and as part of his original salary, he would often negotiate ownership of his director's or work print versions. Radioactive Dreams appears to fall into that category. However, no official high-definition restoration of the full director's cut has surfaced yet. The future does look somewhat promising. Pyun's widow Cynthia is believed to be in possession of the surviving materials, and Yippee continue to put out Pyun's director's cuts with the help of his estate. What remains unclear though is which version of Radioactive Dreams is actually held by Pyun's estate. Is it only the extended Japanese cut, or is there still another version waiting to be uncovered? The original 105-minute 2.351 uncut print has never been seen in high definition, not even the theatrical cut, and for decades fans have been made to do with low-quality 4.3 uploads on YouTube or rare highly sought-after VHS releases. The rights situation is notoriously tangled, and even trying to establish who owns the film is a challenge, with different leads pointing to De Laurentiis Group, Manson International, and MGM. It's hard to imagine that boutique labels wouldn't have jumped on the opportunity already if the rights were straightforward to acquire. Whatever the version, Radioactive Dreams stands as a vivid testament to Pyun's unfiltered imagination, a cult film that has survived in spite of decades of limbo. Buried under film and music right complications, it has lingered in cinematic purgatory, waiting for a chance to rise from the ashes. In summary, Radioactive Dreams is one of those films that slipped through the cracks of pop culture. It wasn't that it lacked imagination, and it wasn't because it arrived too early or too late. If anything, landing on the cusp of the 80s apocalypse boom should have helped it, but instead it got lost in the haze. Distribution and rights issues seem to have plagued it for years, keeping it from ever cementing itself into the mainstream. It existed in that strange space between cult cinema and the early home video era, which meant that for a long time it lived almost like an urban legend, a film people vaguely recalled catching on late-night broadcasts, but couldn't remember clearly enough to know whether they'd seen it or dreamt it. And yet, when you look at what came after it, the punk-infused wastelands of 80s and 90s comics, the neon-ruined futures of anime, the retro-futurist tone of the Fallout game series with their mix of atomic ruins, swing music and dark comedy, you start to feel the echo of a movie like this. It wasn't a blockbuster, it just dared to blend tones most filmmakers kept separate. A post-apocalyptic film that isn't grimdark but playful, a comedy with tragic elements that still has stakes, a detective story set in the ruins of civilization, a movie held together not by realism but by style, music and personality. It knows exactly what it wants to be, even if others didn't know how to read it. That's why Radioactive Dreams matters. Not because it was perfect or polished or widely understood when it came out, but because it represents a kind of filmmaking that barely exists anymore. The kind that says, What if we just try something weird and see if it works? And that's Albert Pyun in a nutshell. Some films survive because they were hits, others survive because they couldn't be silenced. Radioactive Dreams is one of the latter, too strange, too vibrant, too stubbornly itself to disappear completely, and the fact that it still circulates in low-res uploads and aftermarket scraps means it's still discoverable. I'm grateful that we can at least watch it, and that every so often it finds a new audience willing to re-evaluate it as an important piece of film history, far more deserving than simply being a forgotten relic from a pivotal moment in its director's career. Radioactive Dreams is a reminder that cult cinema isn't defined by budget or box office or critical praise, but by the people who keep a film alive when the industry doesn't. It should stand as proof that even the strangest films have a future. All they need is an audience willing to go looking for them.